Well, hello everybody, and welcome to Exam 2 review. Um, oh, sorry, that's the wrong channel. Well, anyway, we have for you um, the Exam 2 review that has been highly anticipated so that we can get this exam going finally. So, as previous exams go, 30 multiple choice questions and two 20-point essays that you can do in two parts online. And let's back it up here and review what we covered in chapter 6. We began with this guy, Immanuel Kant. So a couple of key themes for Kant. One is, and this is perhaps the most important out of everything to say about Kant, is the idea of the active mind that has this innate structure that helps to kind of organize and categorize all sensory input. And that's what makes him a rationalist because of the emphasis here on these innate categories. And so there's a phrase that I have been liking lately when we think about perceptual experience, and it comes up a lot in this unit in particular. The argument frequently is that when we receive information, sensory information from the outside world, this comes in through all of our five senses, that all of that sensory data does not contain a structure, right? It is unstructured and disorganized and essentially meaningless. And the job of the perceptual process here is to go from sensation to perception. But the question, and we, of course, we then realize perception has a structure to it. And by structure, I just mean there's an order, there's a pattern, because that's of course what we see when we look at the world. We see objects and patterns and shapes and so forth. So the question for Kant, the challenge for Kant, is to explain, where does the structure come from, right? Where does the structure of perception come from? And for Kant, it comes from these innate categories of thought. That's what adds structure to our experience. And so the idea for Kant that we just inherently experience the world the way we do, that we experience a three-dimensional reality, that we experience the passage of time the way that we do, that's just part of the inherent structure of the mind. And that's why experience has the structure that it does. It's just inherently built into the way the mind works. This also applies a little bit to Kant's critique of David Hume, if you want to think back to the first unit and Hume and his skeptical views in chapter 5. One of the things that Hume was critical about was our ability to understand and know about causality, of cause and effect. But for Kant, the claim is that, well, yes, that's just one of these innate categories. We inherently, innately understand cause and effect events when we see them, because again, the ability to understand causality is just an inherent part of how the mind works. Now, calling Kant a dualist here is true from a certain perspective, and I may have said in the original lecture that it's a little iffy, so he does have this idea that there are two kinds of realities, right? The noumenal reality and the phenomenal reality. The phenomenal reality is the important one for Kant, because this is the world of our mind. It is the world of experience. And the reason it's so important is that every time we try to talk about anything, I try to describe something. What I'm really doing, according to Kant, is I'm describing my experience. And when I'm talking about something, I'm talking about my experience of something. So if I'm going to describe an object, right, then I'm going to describe its properties in terms of what I perceive it to have, in terms of its shape, size, color, and whatever other things that I might perceive about it. But all of those descriptors that I would use are technically descriptors of my ideas about the object and not about the object itself. So again, the idea is that all descriptions and all human language, and essentially all that we can even think about, boils down to what we would call phenomenal reality. And therefore, because it's essentially all that we can really understand and talk about, that's all that we would really even think is important for Kant. And so you might think, does that mean Kant's actually an idealist? And the answer to that is technically, yeah, I think it is the case that there's another a modest type of view known as transcendental idealism that is used to describe Kant. But there is still this noumenal world. So what in the world is it if we can't describe it or talk about it? Well, Kant just simply leaves it at the idea of there being something outside of us that causes our sensations to occur, right? So that there is something out there that is the cause of sensation and perception. What we know about the structure of perception is still a function of the innate categories, but nevertheless, there is some sort of outside cause to all of our experience. And that's noumenal reality. Not much to say about it other than it's out there. Right? So that's the part that makes Kant also a dualist. We don't need to worry too much about any argument here about how to properly categorize Kant here. Just want you to make sure you have maybe a good understanding of what noumenal and phenomenal mean, and especially the importance of phenomenal for Kantian philosophy. Now, this idea that I was talking about, the need to go from sensation to perception, but in between sensation and perception, there is some sort of structuring process that is captured here by this four-step perceptual theory, right? So again, there's something out there in the world that is the cause of our sensations, but the sensations in and of themselves, just the activation of photoreceptors in the eye or any other sensory organ that we have, just creates the activity of millions of cells, all firing action potentials, individually meaningless with regard to informing about the object that we are experiencing or seeing. So how do the sensations obtain structure? Well, that's something that has to happen. And then the output of that process is to get us a conscious perception of something. So where does the structure come from? Well, if you are Kant, it is the innate categories of thought. If we want to back up and try to remember in chapter 5, when we were talking about the British empiricists, they argued for a bottom-up view. Kant is a top-down view, right, using the innate categories in more of a top-down interpretive way. But the bottom-up view, such as Locke's theory of ideas, rooted in associationism, is another way in which structure is added, right? The sensations are just kind of built together, right? And just constructed and associated with each other. And those associations create a type of structure to experience, right? But in this case, for Kant, the structure is coming from the innate categories. But this now becomes a major theme in this second unit, because as we move on to other people that we've talked about in this unit, a couple of them here in chapter 6, but a few others to mention in, say, chapter 9 here, Hermann Lotz, when he uses the local science. Now, this idea really only helps us for one narrowed kind of part of perception, which is perceiving a three-dimensional world. But his claim is that our sense of touch has privileged access to the three-dimensional world, and we come to just know about a three-dimensional reality from our ability to move our bodies around in three-dimensional space. But then the idea, it becomes a top-down view that this knowledge acquired through our sense of touch can then be used in this top-down interpretive way to help the sense of vision understand its input, which is inherently two-dimensional, and interpret the visual input as a three-dimensional object. And so in that case, again, it's a form of structuring driven by knowledge, and that makes it a top-down process. Also in chapter 6, we get Helmholtz's theory of unconscious inference, in which Helmholtz argues that we use past experience to interpret our incoming sensations. And if we fast forward to chapter 9, the Gestaltists are just yet another example of providing a perceptual theory here where the debate centers around what's going on in step 3. So for Kant, it's innate categories. For Lotz, it's local sign. For Helmholtz, it's past experience through the process of unconscious inference. And for the Gestaltist, it's this organizing process governed by the brain field. So all those Gestalt laws of organization take all of the sensory data and just go to work on it and start organizing it and structuring it in different ways based on the innate brain preferences or preferences of the brain, which are the law of prognance. And this actually may sound a lot like Kant, in which case, yes, the Gestaltists were essentially kind of reiterating a lot of the main ideas of Kantian philosophy. Excuse me. But also they were trying to do so in a way that appealed to the brain, and fledgling 20th century neuroscience to give us an example of what's called biological Kantianism, the idea that we could somehow put Kant's categories into the structure of the brain and appeal to the structure of the brain as the source of perceptual structure, right? So again, we see the theme there is what's going on in step 3 that creates structure to experience. Now, I made a separate slide here for Helmholtz just to unpack this a little bit, because kind of an important topic for this unit, and a fair chance you might see an essay question like this, right? So it's randomized a little bit. So not everyone will get the same essays, but I'll try to give 2 hints, so that way everyone has a reasonable chance at getting hopefully one of those questions. So a whole essay on this whole screen might be something you see on the exam. So make sure you can define the theory, right? How does this theory explain perception, right? And so go back to that 4-step theory and insert into step 3. I kind of break it out sometimes as a step 3A and 3B, right? Step 3A is to recall what some relevant prior experiences, and then step 3B is to use those past experiences unconsciously to infer or interpret the meaning of these sensations, the output of which in step 4 would be conscious perception. Now, make sure that you can also describe evidence in favor of the theory. And that would include a whole variety of different things we talked about in that set of notes regarding experiments that show how experience changes perception. So we're talking about, say, prism adaptation research. We're talking about research on people who may be born with visual impairments and later have their sight restored. We're talking about animals raised in sensory deprived environments, and and also cultural differences in illusions, right? The idea is that people who grow up in different environments with different experiences will have different susceptibility to certain visual illusions, suggesting, of course, that these longstanding differences in someone's perceptual experience influences how the visual system responds to those stimuli. Problems with the theory. Well, number one, of course, the answer was the problem of infinite regress. This is the idea that the answer to how perception works is always sort of pushed into the past. We say that, well, how is it that I'm able to understand my current sensations? And the answer is, well, you have some past experience to draw from. And again, so I say, okay, well, then thinking about those past experiences, how did I understand it then? And the answer was still, you had some past experience to draw from. So what this is kind of getting at is the idea is that the theory never explains how that knowledge kind of gets into us in the first place, which is called the problem of learning. And it really, right, it just basically boils down to this theory doesn't explain how, when we are newborns and we don't have past experiences to draw from, how are we able to start making sense out of the world? And in that situation, we presumably would have to rely on a more bottom-up approach to understand things. But of course, that's not what the theory is proposing. The theory is proposing that it's as a top-down theory of perception. Another thing that I think I talked about was how this theory challenges or deals with the problem of constancy, which is the idea that we perceive constant objects. We perceive objects as having a constant shape and size, despite the fact that retinal images are always varying. And the way that we try to traditionally solve the problem of constancy through perceptual theory, like Helmholtz's theory here, is to suggest that, when looking at the doorway, which was an example from the original slides, the door swings open and it transforms into a trapezoid in the image, but we don't see it that way. We see it as a rectangle that's rotating and seeing it from a different vantage point. So the claim is that when I'm looking at that projected image and it's really more like a trapezoid in the image, that I am accessing past memories of how rectangles look from different perspectives, so that I can properly recognize that the door is really a rectangle. And that is a problem of circular logic. It's called begging the question. And the idea is that in this situation, we are not supposed to know what kind of object we're looking at yet, because that's the goal of step 3, is to help us figure out what it is we're looking at. But if we're able to somehow have some sort of advanced knowledge of the kind of object we're looking at, so I can consult relevant past experiences that will help me recognize what I'm looking at, then I've kind of given myself the answer in advance, right? I can access past experiences with rectangles, even though I don't know that that door is really a rectangle. So how should I know that those past experiences are the right ones to use? So if you're following that, the idea is that the question seems, or this theory seems to require some information that we're not supposed to be privileged to, right? Knowing if we're at, the question is, what are we perceiving right now? And in order to be able to figure that out, it has to already know what we're perceiving. And obviously that's cheating. So the theory maybe cheats a little bit. Now we're going to move into chapter 7. We've got some of the 19th century neuroscience. We started with psychophysics. So this is hopefully relatively straightforward. So I'll just go through it fairly quickly here. Make sure you can define an absolute threshold and a difference threshold, and understand the difference between those two terms. Make sure you can do the same thing for the 3 methods for measuring and detecting thresholds: method of limits, method of adjustment, method of constant stimuli. Same goes for the 3 psychophysical functions listed here, right? Weber's law, Fechner's law, and Stevens' power law. How are they different from each other? You're not going to do math on the exam, but a familiarity with what each law means: the linear relationship of Weber's law, the logarithmic relationship of Fechner's law, and the power law, exponential function of Stevens' power law, right? And how each one advanced on the previous one. Also in this chapter, we looked at more of the kind of what we typically think of as neuroscience research, right? Trying to study the function of various parts of the nervous system and the brain. And so we had a few ideas, some of the philosophical inspiration coming from the French sensationalist movement, Mueller's doctrine of specific nerve energies, which, by the way, is another example of biological Kantianism, that Mueller kind of thought that he was discovering Kant's categories in the sensory nerves. And then the whole localization of function thing. And maybe we could mention a little bit about phrenology there. But what I want to focus on here are these 3 methods. These are the more scientific methods that emerged in the 19th century: the ablation method, autopsy method, and electrical stimulation. So again, make sure you can define those, and make sure you can maybe associate a few discoveries with each one of them. Chapter 8 is up next. We get Wundt and the founding of the psychology laboratory. This is not a class that tends to have lots of names, places, and dates in it, but I tend to repeatedly mention this particular name, place, and date. It's maybe a bit important in the grand scheme of things for the history of psychology. So, make sure you note that at least. So make sure you know what volunteerism, right? That's Wundt's school of thought. His approach was to study the action of the will, which he believed governed our immediate experience. So that's the first level of these 2 levels of consciousness that Wundt theorized. So the immediate experience, where the will is directly involved, this is the kind of psychology that Wundt claimed to use the experimental methods, right? So all of that pendulum clock experiment, that's called the thought meter, reaction time studies, psychophysical studies, all of that stuff falls under the heading of the experimental methods to study the aspects of our immediate experience that he called perception, apperception, and creative synthesis. And so make sure you know what those are as well. And then there's also mediate experience. And this is the idea that there are other things that we know about that are part of the human mind and human experience, but they are not created by any one person's will, such as culture, for example, right? Culture is certainly created by people, but it's created by groups of people all kind of living together, and kind of these cultural patterns emerge out of groups. But there's no single individual will that creates culture, but rather culture is, again, this emergent interaction between people. So it certainly must be something that emerges out of the collective brain power, if you will, of large groups of people. But But that doesn't mean that we can use these experimental methods of reaction time studies or introspection studies or psychophysical studies to understand culture, right? We have to use different methods. We have to use the methods of cultural psychology or anthropology or sociology. All of these other kinds of large groups, social sciences, were all very much equally in their infancy, as was psychology in this late 19th century time. And Wundt wrote about a lot of that stuff in his work on cultural psychology. The book was called Volker Psychology. He didn't do a lot of that research really, but he wrote quite a bit about it, had a lot to say about it. Also in this chapter, Titchener and the structuralist view of things. And so again, where does this term structure comes in again, right? And so again, the question is, where does the structure come from? So far, we've had a variety of different theories about where the structure may come from. For Titchener, he's not attempting to try to develop a theory without first trying to observe something. So his claim is that what we can try to do is to train research participants to introspect, to observe what's happening inside of them during step 3 of the perceptual process. This is the part that didn't quite work out very well for Titchener, but you can understand what his goal was, is that rather than trying to just develop a theory about what happens in step 3, like that list that I had up before from Kant and Lotz and Helmholtz and the Gestaltists, he wants to try to observe it through introspection, and that then having his trained subjects introspecting, they could then report and tell him what was happening, and then he could formulate a more descriptive scientific theory of what it was that they reported. Of course, that doesn't work, but that was his goal, right? To try to break the mind down into its elemental units and the rules for how those basic units go together. And I sometimes compare that to the blocks of a building plus the blueprint. And the blueprint would be the structure, right? How does that structure get created? So a fascination with the structure of subjective experience leads us to this whole group of early psychologists studying what we call phenomenology. And this term, of course, derives from Kant's phenomenal world. The idea is that, well, if there is a world out there that causes our sensory experience, that's noumenal reality, then the study of that is for physicists and the rest of the other sciences. But in order to study experience and to study mind, we need to study the phenomenal world. And hence we get the word phenomenology, the study of the phenomenal world, the study of meaningful conscious experience. And this is where we get Husserl's idea of the Wesensschau, right? The true essence of a meaningful experience is the Wesensschau. And we want to understand what that is. And maybe we can use introspection. We can just have people talk about it, but not in that reductionist way that Titchener was trying to do, to just have people talk about what they might be experiencing in step 3 of their perceptual process, but rather more about step 4, right? What's happening in terms of your conscious reaction to an event or a stimulus of some sort. In fact, for Brentano, the claim is that's the only thing we can do, is that trying to break the mind down into bits and pieces that would be individually meaningless cannot really be possible for Brentano. The idea is that all mental acts have content. They have, and that's what we are aware of and what we're thinking about. And that's all happening at step 4. That's the only thing we can really talk about if you're Brentano, is what I'm aware of and the content of my experience. And so we might say that whatever might happen in step 3 is something that is not really cognitively penetrable, would be the appropriate term for this, right? Now, Brentano does say that we might have different ways of using introspection and different ways to study what's going on inside the mind. And so we have this 3. So here's my next major hint outside of the Helmholtz question. This is another question you might see pop up on the exam, which is defining all 3 of these methods of studying consciousness. Direct inner observation is Brentano's word for what Titchener was doing. Trying to observe your experience in the moment is happening. Brentano criticized this because he said that as soon as you try to observe what's happening in your mind, you're necessarily changing what's happening in your mind. And therefore, trying to observe an experience always alters the experience. However, it is possible to have an experience, and once that experience is complete, you could then reflect on it and introspect about it after it is over, and that would be indirect inner observation. And so Brentano considers that this is perhaps a valid type of introspection, whereas he was critical of direct inner observation. Of course, it is also possible, even though Brentano might have liked this, it's also possible to criticize indirect inner observation because, of course, it is still introspection. It is still highly subjective and cannot be, objectively verified, and therefore is not really scientific. And the same potentially goes for objective observation. We can observe the behavior of others, but if I want to try to infer the kinds of intentional mental acts that other people have just by observing their behavior, I'm heavily relying on inference. And this is also sometimes called the problem of other minds, that how do I even really know that this other person who I can observe behaving really even has a mind? They could be what we call the philosophical zombie, right? The idea that it's something that acts in ways that are convincingly human, but that doesn't by itself prove that that agent has a mind and has feelings and has intentions. And so we tend to, what Daniel Dennett says, adopt an intentional stance towards other people and act as if other people have minds, even though we can never truly know that they have minds. And so that's the concern here of objective observation, which is that it falls prey a little bit to the problem of other minds. So my hint: define all three of those methods, identify which one was the one Titchener used, and also be able to discuss problems with each of those three methods. Moving into chapter 9, we have the Gestalt. I already mentioned that a little bit earlier. The idea is that we have this echo of Kant's innate categories, right? Something is happening to automatically add structure to perception. Because the Gestaltists really are convinced of this because of their study of things like illusory contours or illusory motion, called the phi phenomenon. They call this structuring process the law of prognance, this preference for the brain to just prefer to see certain kinds of patterns. And to the extent possible, it will impose those patterns onto sensory input by using these grouping principles. So like that, I think, mostly sums up the Gestalt theory. There's a little more detail in the notes about the idea between the principle of isomorphism, treating the brain as something like an analog measurement device that is distinct from the more modern cognitive view that treats the brain as a digital computer, which is something we'll get to in a later chapter once we get to this cognitive chapter. I think that's chapter 14. But for now, we can at least distinguish the Gestalt idea of isomorphism. Last in this unit, chapter 10, and the perceptual theory of J.J. Gibson. He's arguing for a direct theory, direct perception theory. The idea is that no longer do we have the so-called translator problem. That's an example I've used a few times. Translator problem is when you're speaking to a person who speaks another language. Obviously, their language is not something you understand, but if you have a translator, an intermediary, then they can convert to your language. But the problem is that you only know what your translator has told you, and you're to some extent at the mercy of the translator, and we have to question whether we can trust the translator. So in our four-step perceptual theory that I've been talking about here, the idea is that the translation is what happens in step 3, right? We have to convert sensation to perception, and that's a process that requires some sort of translation, interpretation, structuring, whatever, but all of those words are synonymous with what translators have to do. Gibson says, what if we change the presumption? So part of the presumption of that four-step theory is, mostly all these theories have debated step 3, right? They seem to agree that all 4 steps exist. They just differ over what exactly happens in step 3. But Gibson says, let's back it up and let's reevaluate step 2, right? Step 2 was defined previously as meaningless sensations. But what if we say that maybe there's actually information available to our sensory organs, right? That there's an array of ambient light that contains a structure, and that the structure of the ambient light is sufficient to inform a seeing animal with a functioning visual system uh, about the structure of the environment. So it kind of comes back to that question, where does the structure come from? All of the theories that we have talked about so far have made the claim that structure has to be added internally. Gibson is the radical here because he is making the claim that the structure is external, right? There's a quote used in the textbook that I still really like, right? This is William Mace writing about Gibson. He says, it matters not what is inside your head, but what your head is inside of. And so again, the point is it's not about whatever structure is being added inside through in this internal step 3, but it's about the head being inside of an environment that contains richly structured energy arrays that can inform all of our various sensory modalities about the world around us. And so the structure comes from perception itself. It comes from the environment and our ecological niche, which contains energy. And so that's the essence of Gibsonian direct perception theory, or the ecological theory, is that the environment contains the structure. And therefore, with this, we no longer need to have an internal structuring process. We just go from environment to perception, right? So we're skipping a lot of steps in that 4-step theory. We're just throwing them out now. We just got the environment. We have to have a sensory system that can respond to the energy of that environment, and then we have perception. Perception is also importantly used in the control of action. So Gibson also gives us the perception action cycle and the concept of the affordance, right? That the main object of our perception is to perceive the kinds of actions that I can perform with a particular object. Well, that wraps up chapter 10. Of course, there's a little more detail still if you go back to the notes, but I just want to hit the high points here. The goal, of course, is to ensure that you understand what the major themes and how they connect with each other, and what we're really looking for in this unit, so that you're all set for this exam. So, of course, don't forget I have my office hours. I'm just available. If you have questions, you can also just send an inbox message, and I will be as prompt as I can in replying to you.